Okay, I guess we can start. Welcome again. As MeetLab, we are pleased to have you, especially Simon, Dayanucan, all other guests, our friends, our colleagues. So we are happy to host you here. This is the second talk, so most of you are familiar with the topic, so I'll try to keep it short uh, by mentioning some core issues. Does the Morality-as-Cooperation Questionnaire predicts diverse moral behaviors? It also includes moral foundations questionnaire, as you will see. But since it's pre-registered in this way, I keep the title is in the pre-registration. So first, a brief background. As you all know, validity crisis is an important issue that we all have been dealing with. Here is some examples of validity crisis. This one I like. The sample is GPSP papers published in 2014, all papers. On each paper, there are 20 measures per paper, and around 80% of them are latent, so they include multiple items. And only around half of them have a reference to previous validation or a validity analysis in that paper. Hussey and Hughes named them as V hacking and V ignorance. I guess they imply intention, so probably ignorance is, let's say, milder version of it probably. They analyzed AI ID data, a huge data. It includes 15 widely used scales of psychology, including social dominance orientation, Big Five personality, Rosenberg self-esteem. So all those well-known scales, and the amount of acceptable fit to the data is only 73%. But more dramatically, measurement invariance is only around 4% across different age groups and across different gender groups, which means that those widely used scales are not eligible for group comparison, for t-tests across age groups and different gender groups. So those are red flags, especially in terms of validity. And moral psychology is not immune to those validity crisis issues. Probably you are all familiar with the issues, especially with the moral foundations questionnaire. The first one, there are hundreds of papers, maybe thousands of them, which relies on a scale which is not working, basically, which is not valid. So we have been dealing with these validity issues. Those are not basically competing frameworks, morality-as-cooperation and moral foundations theory. I wouldn't say that they are complementing each other as well. They have their own tracks, probably. Here is a brief summary of those theories. So I am not going to discuss them in detail since you are all familiar with it, but MEC defines 7 moral elements. MFQ defines the recent version of moral foundations, defines 6 dimensions, which are perhaps probably with social preferences that in your terminology probably. Those are the social preferences defined by those theories. Morality-as-Cooperation theory lacks specific hypotheses, so they claim that all those dimensions are solutions to some cooperation problem, evolved strategies to cooperation problems, and they don't have, as I said, specific hypotheses. They claim that, or let's say Curie claims that there might be some weights, there might be some cultural differences and so on, but we all hold those dimensions. Moral foundations theory, or those dimensions based on some anthropological evidence, which is the widely known critic for moral foundations theory, dimensions are a bit vague, or the source of dimensions. The theory claims that those moral dimensions works as intuitions, which leads our behavior, and they define some boundary conditions, well-known individualizing binding distinction, where care and fairness are weighted more by liberals and other dimensions are weighted more by conservatives. Now, the thing is, there are very few studies tested the relationship between those moral sensitivities, moral dimensions, and moral behavior. Here is the results. Some of the results are from lab findings. So in one of the recent findings, we found that loyalty predicted cooperation fairness as well, predicted cooperation measured by public good scale, and generosity, fairness also predicted generosity, which is measured by donation task. And moral foundations, in terms of moral foundations theory, only care predicted donation. The result comes from the same study. So the motivation behind this study is that, as I said, the relationship between moral dimensions and moral behavior is lacking, so we don't know much about that relationship. There are only few studies which focus on moral intentions, not behavior. Again, one of our study and Curry's study used moral prosocial intentions to test the validity of those measures and theories. And also, there are lots of issues related to psychometric properties of those scales. Probably you all know those issues. And again, how those moral judgments may vary across different groups is an issue. We don't know that well. There is only one study I know, Davis study, 2016. They found that moral foundations theory is not working well across black people, or black people and white people understand different things. There is no measurement invariance across different ethnic groups in the United States, which means that we shouldn't use moral foundations theory to compare black and white people in terms of moral sensitivities. But this is the only data we have regarding the invariance of moral foundations. So those are the basically psychometric motivations we have. And based on those considerations, we designed our study to fill those three gaps. The research, previous research, rely on cross-sectional design. So those are not pure predictive validity tests. And they use narrow behavioral scope of prior research. So they either use cooperation or donation. They ignore other types of prosocial behavior. And as I mentioned, there's insufficient test of measurement invariance on those scales. So those are two pre-registered hypotheses. We expect that all those McQ dimensions will predict cooperation measured with prisoner's dilemma, and all those dimensions will predict generalized prosociality, which is a combined score of those economic games. So there were three parts in this study. The first part includes 1,200 prolific workers. They were pre-screened for religious identity, so half believers, half non-believers. And they collected morality measures, basically morality-as-cooperation and moral foundations. 7 months from the first measure, we recruit them again, half of them respond, and we let them to fulfill prosocial behavior tasks or economic games. And 10 months from the second measure, we re-invited them again, and again around half of them participated, and they fulfilled almost the same prosocial behavior tasks again. So here is the summary or list of the measures. On the first part, they fulfilled MEC and MFQ, basically. And then on the second and third phases, they fulfilled prosocial behavior tasks, including generosity, cooperation, trustworthiness, cooperative norm enforcement or punishment, moral courage, punishment with counter-punishment opportunity, honesty, utilitarianism, conformity. So we I am not going to mention that part, but we factor analyzed all those games, and we created a total prosociality score, including generosity, cooperation, trust, and trustworthiness. So by using those four scores, we created a total prosociality score as an index of overall prosocial behavior. So here is the result. So first, we tried to validate the factor structure of both morality-as-cooperation theory and moral foundations theory, and we conducted lots of different models. And we used different, let's say, psychometric approaches to test them as confirmatory factor analysis and exploratory structural equation modeling. I'm not going to bother you with those details, but a very brief side information is here for the analytic approach. This is the common exploratory factor analysis where there is no constraint. This is the classical conventional confirmatory factor analysis, which is highly strict constraint model. There is no cross-loadings here, as you see. And exploratory structural equation modeling is a idea is not new, but psychometrically it's a recent statistical procedure which estimates cross-loadings, but assumes that those loadings will be close to zero. And it uses target rotation, a specific rotation, which allows cross-loadings between items and latent factors. So the original Moral Foundation Questionnaire, the second version, uses exploratory structural equation modeling, and in that way they get valid results. They found that the scale fit well with the data. So we tested both classical confirmatory factor analysis and SEM version of it. So here is the results. Basically, 7-factor of Morality-as-Cooperation and 6-factor of MFQ2 works well under both confirmatory factor analysis and exploratory structural equation modeling. But this one is a revised model. We excluded one item because it failed to load significantly from authority subscale. And then we tested lots of alternative models, including single factor, 2-factor, second order, first order factors, and so on. So again, as a brief side information, we tested if, let's say, those 6 or 7 factors loaded on a higher order factor as cooperation or individualizing and binding. So 2-factor, higher order 2-factor dimensions and single factor dimensions. The reason we tested those issues is that on the original paper, they collected data from 16 different cultures in MFQ2, and they failed to find those classical binding individualizing distinctions. So it turns out that those binding individualizing distinctions seems to occur only on English-speaking Anglo-Saxon samples. So we want to test if we will able to find this binding individualizing distinction. And basically we replicate what they found on the original study. Both scales showed good fit for second order single factor model, which means that all those moral dimensions can be clustered as a higher order latent factor, which might be termed as cooperation. And second order single factor model as well provided good fit for moral foundations. So we can sum all those 6 factors and we can call them as cooperation, but we cannot cluster them as binding and individualizing, especially for moral foundations 2 questionnaire. But interestingly, although MEC is silent about binding and individualizing, we tested if we can divide those 7 dimensions as binding and individualizing. And we had a good fit there. So 7 factors of Morality-as-Cooperation can be clustered as cooperation, and also it can be clustered as binding and individualizing. But I urge caution that binding and individualizing is a theoretical distinction which is created by us. So it doesn't rely on a previous data, previous conceptualization as in moral foundations theory. And then the more interesting part, but the disappointing part, is we try to predict actual prosocial behavior tasks using those scales. And as you see, we don't have much consistent results. Basically, when you check Morality-as-Cooperation, loyalty predicted overall prosociality and generosity on both part B and part C, so across 2 waves. This is the only consistent finding for Morality-as-Cooperation. So I'm not going to interpret or talk on each finding because there might be lots of issues like some selection bias and so on. So only consistent ones probably matters most. And here is care. Care seems to be the strongest predictor and consistent predictor of pro-social economic games. It predicted almost all the games in expected way. And also authority dimension of moral foundations predicted conformism, or what Simon called as rule following. The conformity task we used is very similar to the green light, red light measure of Simon's, but it's a binary measure. The one we used is a binary measure of rule following. And authority predicted that measure on both measures. So there are some psychometric issues that is good to mention. So it seems that finally we have scales which shows good validity. Both morality-as-cooperation and moral foundations theory showed good fit to the data, and maybe more importantly, they showed measurement invariance across believers and non-believers, and also across different political groups, as political liberals and conservatives, which means that we can use those scales across those groups and we can compare scores from those groups, which will give us an unbiased comparison of those groups, because scales are working equally well and in a similar way across those groups. But here is the thing, there are some differences in terms of factor analysis. Make scale performs better on conventional confirmatory factor analysis, which implies that those moral dimensions are orthogonal to each other, which is a bit bold to claim. And moral foundations questionnaire work better on exploratory structural equation modeling, which allows cross-loading. So still, we need to consider if those moral dimensions are orthogonal to each other or correlated to each other. Theoretically, it's wise to expect that they will be correlated with each other, but statistical results might offer otherwise. Here's another issue. It might seem that we have two scales, both of them are working, but they have different forms. So for morality-as-cooperation, only relevance form is working. But the recent Moral Foundations questionnaire includes only judgment form. So there is only one form on the recent version. So those two scales are not measuring directly the same thing. One of them asks relevance, one of them asks questions on judgment. So those are two different things. There's something that we need to consider. And also we need to consider other types of invariance. Some of you already know that we already finished the TÜBİTAK project on longitudinal invariance of those measures. We might mention it maybe later. But here is the thing. So we have scales, valid scales. They seem to be working, but their predictive power is modest. So effects are too weak and not consistent. So the next question is if those moral judgments are really related to actual moral behavior, or those preferences really manifest themselves on actual moral behavior, is a question. But care seems to be the strongest and consistent predictor of all of those measures. And maybe as a final comment would be that the relationship between those moral dimensions and actual moral behavior seems to be complex and domain specific. So they need more research to explore that complexity. And that's all. Thank you for listening. Do we have a couple minutes for questions? No?
No question. Okay.
Okay.
Dayan hocam.
There's an aspect of morality, I think, which rarely gets any attention and certainly has not, it has implicit representation in these scales, but it's not explicit, which is to say that what is the moral thing to do in a particular situation often depends on the relationship between the entities involved. And so it's kind of misleading to talk about morality in general, whereas morality under these relational circumstances would seem a little more amenable to measurement. But we don't have instruments for that.
Exactly.
So can you comment on that?
So I completely agree with that. So what might be interesting for this matter is Davies' discussion on the difference between white and black people revolves around this type of discussion. So they did not explicitly refer to the entity, but they refer that black people perceive the interaction partner differently. So their religiosity is a bit different than white people. They are more religious than white people, but also they are more liberal than white people. So they perceive other people different than white people. This is why probably moral foundation questionnaire is not working on black people. So when we ignore probably the entity, then it might lead to such issues. And probably it's not the only thing that we need to consider. Janoff Bullman discussed a lot, but it's again an ignored issue. Simon mentioned it. Do's and don'ts are two different things. So helping someone and not harming someone are two different things. So prescription and proscription are two different things. Maybe we might also include it in the measure of the morality. So this is one of my ideals, by the way. So create a scale where we adopt both the entity, the interaction partner, and the, let's say, prescriptions and proscriptions all together, but not a huge scale. In a small scale, hopefully in someday we might create a better measure, including it.
Curious about something really small. I just noticed that you excluded people who shifted in religious identity, 36
Yes.
people. Was it just a practical issue, like categorization issue, or does this identity shift in religion mean something about cooperation or something?
It might mean something, but there are only around 30 people.
36, I saw.
Yeah.
So did you check their responses? Did they shift their attitudes somehow?
So first thing, we don't know if they shift. So basically, those people's responses are, so we also ask their religious affiliation and their pre-screen, so their responses on prolific and our data is different. So that it's a mismatch. So we don't know if they are shifted or it's a miscoding or something else.
Okay, I missed that part, but it's interesting.
Yeah, it might be interesting.
Okay, maybe we can
Thank
continue. Thank you. And maybe we can also add something like rule following to a new moral theory. Can we?
Rule following is a new dimension.
Yeah, as a new moral element or moral foundations.
So it's an interesting question. Rule following is in fact included fractions of rule following is included in those cases, in authority, loyalty. Those are, so they not formally or explicitly or systematically included, but rule following is in those scales. But maybe we might formally introduce it, but then so the level of analysis seems to be different as compared to those moral theories and what you have offered.
I mean, I think when you can think of these features of morality-as-cooperation, these are rules too. Be loyal, care for your family, protect your property. I don't know what I don't recall them all on the top of my head, but you can formulate them as rules. Yeah, this is not, rule following. It's something we discussed before. It's like in many situations, people infer what the rule is, or be loyal is certainly a rule. Yeah, and for instance, care for other people is a rule. Yeah. So I think it's I think from my perspective is it's if that's the rule, then the question is, do people follow it? Under what condition? Given my framework, that's how I would think about it. But I think we can certainly call the dimension rules. They can be formulated as such.
Thank you.
Yok. Sen de misin?